for the most part, I think he's just a guy who really believes he's smarter than most, or all, and therefore has the best opinions that are so good and bestest that he presents them as actual facts. And so as a teacher, that makes him terrible. As a self-help guru, that's fine, I guess. We distort facts all the time to motivate ourselves, and for good reason. I know this because I myself am extremely smart and wise and can do a backflip. More backflips than you. But Peterson is more than just a terrible yet inspiring teacher, obviously. Because Peterson has long graduated from being some random professor from the podunk town of Toronto. As we noted, Jordan rose to fame from becoming a prominent right-wing figure. Those who admire him might characterize him as challenging the status quo of academic and PC culture, which brings us to the second part of his persona, the Outlaw. The first story that put J. Pete on the map comes from the fall of 2016, when Peterson began trending for his vocal defiance of Canada's Gender Identity Rights Bill C-16. In a series of extremely f***ing long YouTube videos, I wonder what that's like, Peterson claimed that C-16 was an attack on free speech. He claimed that C-16 counted as compelled speech, forcing people like himself to use specific words lest they be put in jail. To quote an interview, Bill C-16 writes social constructionism into the fabric of the law. Social constructionism is the doctrine that all human roles are socially constructed. They're detached from the underlying biology and from the underlying objective world. So Bill C-16 contains an assault on biology and an implicit assault on the idea of objective reality. Hey Jordan, you know what else is a social construct that's an assault on objective reality? Religion. Anyway, when speaking to the Toronto Sun, Peterson claimed, "These laws are the first laws that I've seen that require people under the threat of legal punishment to employ certain words, to speak a certain way, instead of merely limiting what they're allowed to say, so the laws put words into our mouths." It was a big public stink as Peterson boldly proclaimed that, "No, good sir, he will not be forced to use preferred pronouns of his students." Though recently, he's also said that he'd personally judge if someone legitimately needed him to use their legal name or pronouns, and if they were trying to trick him. Though also every chance he gets, he dead names Elliot Page and calls him her, so maybe not actually the thing he said he would do. But the point is, no law, such as C-16, will force him to do it. And if they dared to jail him, he would go on a hunger strike to defend our precious rights to free speech.
If they find me, I won't pay it. If they put me in jail, I'll go on a hunger strike.
Wow, that's some real V for Vendetta shit. If the government of Canada is indeed threatening to jail teachers for using the wrong pronouns with students, that would be straight up dystopian. When do we all revolt against Canada? Is it now, eh? I got my war rig all warmed up. It's just sitting there in my yard, so let's do this. Except wait, here's an idea. Let's look at what Bill C-16 actually says, because it turns out that Bill C-16 is just an amendment to the Canadian Human Rights Act, adding the words gender identity as a protected group in 3 sections of the original act, and that's it. It adds trans folk into the list of groups protected from discrimination along with age, race, sex, disabilities, and religions. And it amended the criminal code for hate crimes and hate speech to include gender identity on that list as well. And that's it. It didn't force anyone to use a preferred pronoun lest they be jailed. It's extremely innocuous and for like discrimination in housing and employment. C-16 was later passed and wouldn't you know it, nothing changed. I mean, except for trans people having a tad more rights to not be discriminated against. No one was jailed for using the wrong pronouns because of course they weren't. In other words, everything Peterson was taking this bold stance against, hunger strike threats, freedom fighter shit, was a fantasy. It was never in this bill, something anyone who simply read the thing would know. He was performing theater, virtue signaling against trans rights and putting himself in the spotlight as a free speech warrior. Yes, he apparently was asked by his bosses at the University of Toronto to respect the pronouns of students, but not under the penalty of jail time. Just like to make school better for students, but also just and say okay and do it. Or use they or call them by their actual names because you're a teacher in a professional environment and not a big weird baby. But of course, Jordan got big and famous for his anti-trans, pretending to be about freedom of speech stance and has been playing the hits ever since.
But the suspension will not be lifted unless I delete the hateful tweet in question, and I would rather die than do that.
Just delete it, man. It's easy. Jordan the Outlaw retired in 2017 from his role at the University of Toronto, but kept his tenure until recently. He has since broken up with them completely because, quote, an appalling ideology of diversity, inclusion, and equity is demolishing education and business. Dude literally quit because there was too much inclusion, going on to say that his heterosexual white male graduate students weren't getting enough research positions. To me, it's pretty clear that Jordan Peterson has officially found it way more lucrative to play the role of a right-wing grifter, going on speaking tours and writing useless books, than to work a regular job that might provide something for society, like me and my important work with Warmbow. Because clearly, his lobster ideology got in the way of his ability to work with others, which is what inclusion is kind of all about. The thing about Peterson's railing against inclusion and equity and all that is that he never gives an alternative. If he can't admit that or acknowledge that there is a very clear history of racism in places like the United States and Canada that is still reverberating and affecting people, then he's unserious. And if he acknowledges it, he needs to admit he doesn't think anything should be done about it. But apparently, he can't seem to accept working with trans or liberal or diverse students, and so he's just gonna be this conservative loudmouth instead. Of course, funny fact, if you were to ask Peterson if he's a right-winger, he would actually disagree with you.
Their basic proposition is that, first of all, that I'm a right-winger of some sort, and that's just not the case.
So apparently, there's an argument that Jordan Peterson is not a right-winger, and he is one of the only people who makes it. And a lot of others have pointed out that most of what he teaches is about philosophy and apolitical, and his anti-PC culture stuff has been overly highlighted, and doesn't reflect the full spectrum of his opinions. The fact that he frequently attacks the left has attracted some far-right fans, but by at least some accounts, his audience tends to be pretty diverse. So you could argue that calling him a right-wing grifter is a bad strategy, because it paints the left as being against everything he talks about, as if he is not against everything the left talks about. And he is occasionally the subject of misinformation. He went viral for apparently saying we should have enforced monogamy to solve the incel problem, as if he was proposing mandatory wives for depressed young men, but he wasn't actually saying that.
What do you mean by enforced monogamy?
Well, we could start by what I don't mean. I don't mean taking innocent women at gunpoint and handing them over to useless men, which is essentially the accusation. And it was really interesting to watch that unfold. What I meant was that monogamy as something that's socially valued appears to be essentially a human universal. That doesn't mean that human beings are universally monogamous, because obviously we're not. We can be serially monogamous, and some people are players and have multiple partners and all of that. But there's a strong proclivity across known societies to tilt towards monogamy. And the enforcement is social norms.
Fair enough. I mean, I don't know if he's correct, but the point is that he was trying, perhaps failing, to say that we should stress monogamy as a social norm. Which again, not sure I agree with that, but maybe I'll ask around at the next orgy. This is all to say that Peterson isn't exactly your Ben Shapiro or Stevens Crowder, in that he allegedly doesn't actively push right-wing talking points and often comes across as reasonable. And again, as a self-help guru, I would argue that he's generally probably maybe okay at it. Of course, I'm not a self-help expert, so maybe he's actually terrible. But it should stand out that while Peterson often goes after Marxism and the radical left types using extremely flawed arguments, he almost never points that lens at the far right, often unfairly so. For example,
I think what I would have done was walk into the voting booth with the intention of voting for Clinton, and then at the last minute gone, to hell with it, I'm not doing it, and voted for Trump. I think that's what I would have done. And I thought about it a lot afterwards. I mean, for the entire election, virtually, I thought, well, Clinton has the experience necessary to at least keep the status quo in motion, Right. So in some sense, she was a conservative choice because she'd been in politics for so long. So, but then as the campaign continued and she continued to beat the identity politics drum louder and louder, I became more and more concerned about her political direction or ideological direction.
Once again, he takes the centrist position, claiming that he would have voted for Hillary, except noting that it would have been a conservative choice, and then decides that ultimately he would have voted for Trump instead, because Trump doesn't play identity politics. You know, Trump, famous for not politicizing religion or race, social background by waving a Bible around and saying, "I love Christmas," or calling Mexicans rapists or bragging about how rich he is. Clearly, it was only Clinton who, totally unprompted by her opponent, resorted to identity politics. Interesting how all of Jordan's totally centrist beliefs always land on the side of the right wing, even when his reasoning makes zero sense. Hey, thanks for watching that clip. Here's the evergreen end plate to ask you to like and subscribe. It's any day of the year where you are.